right, so we've discussed kind of the explanation for and understanding a little bit about the why of religion, right? We've discussed that it's belief in supernatural beings. We've discussed whether there is evidence for um, kind of primitive religion or animism evolving into polytheism and monotheism. Now let's talk about what forms religion takes. Anthropologists do not rank people on an evolutionary scale of complexity. That just simply, I mean, it's not true with culture, it's not true with language, it's certainly not true with religion. But there are some clear correlations between political organization, mode of subsistence or adaptive strategy, and religious practices. And so we will talk specifically about four things. We'll talk about clan spirits, totemism, shamanism, and polytheism and monotheism. But just a little bit of discussion before we ever get started. When we look at foraging populations, their religion almost always takes the form of animism, this tie to the natural world, this tie to sometimes having ancestors intercede on their behalf. Sometimes we're talking about clan spirits, which relates to these first 2 points, both the clan spirits and totemism. So we're talking about some kind of tie to some individual from the natural world, whether that's animal, plant, a geological feature, or ancestors. When we transition to horticultural and pastoral sorts of tribes, we often see aspects of animism hanging on, but we're more likely to then invoke some shamanism as well. And so we'll talk about what that means in just a few moments. Um, by and large, polytheism and monotheism are only present in agricultural and or industrial societies. And so we will talk a little bit about the polytheism and kind of the Olympic pantheons and things similar to beliefs that like the pharaohs were deific and actually either represented a god come down to the earth or somehow some important inherited innate ability to be a vessel for the gods. Um, and so we're talking about agricultural states and chiefdoms. Interestingly, it was proposed that as we've shifted to this post industrial world, we would see a loss of religion, that we would see secular things like secular humanism and kind of a quote unquote belief in science, which I hate to hear it termed a belief in science because science is fact. It's not something that you can either believe or disbelieve in. It's constantly being reevaluated in light of new evidence, etc. But it's still that's how a lot of people frame it, as this belief in science, kind of at the expense of religion. But we really haven't. We'll talk about that towards the end of this lecture. So we'll start with clan spirits. When we'll talk about clan spirits and clan identities in Papua New Guinea. So the significance of clan membership, and we've talked about what clans are, right? Lineages are when you can demonstrate your descent from a specific individual. Clans are when you have stipulated descent, where you can't really be related to something like a crocodile because it's simply not biologically possible. However, you still count a crocodile as one of your ancestors, as kind of the apical ancestor of your particular lineage. So we already know the role that clan membership plays in kinship, marriage, etc. Now let's look at how it's reflected in religious systems. The Ninjarum live in low population density forests. They view their traditional clan lands as being inhabited by a range of spirits with human emotions and motivations. These spirits are oftentimes animal based, though, or taking an animal form. The Alema and Parari live in higher density villages that are full of longhouses. And so here, The clans are seen as inhabiting specifically designed house forts, a specific sedentary location rather than the forest more generally. So, in this animist tradition of having um, spirits that you're tied to, whether through ancestry or whether through this clan membership, we can see some predictable differences in how it's structured and conceptualized based on whether kind of how the rest of their social system is structured and conceptualized. And so the Ninjarum are quite a bit, I mean, with the lower population density, quite a bit less tied to specific structures per se. Okay, there's still a lot of spatial mobility and social mobility. So when foragers are practicing uh, animism, and whether or not they recognize clans as a form of lineage, their spiritual members, their spiritual beings, range just as far as they range. They inhabit, for example, the forest instead of inhabiting a particular structure. When we shift to higher population density, more clearly defined ownership, etc., then we see predictable shifts to these supernatural beings being tied to a single village or being tied to a single building. So, we can think about this in the following way, right? Is your house or is your church a holier place? I mean, by modern Christian theology, you've got that direct access. There could be places in your house that are holy places. In a lot of other cultures, even in Hispanic culture, with the altars that are set up for like uh, Dia de los Muertos, right? We can see that there are areas of our home that we might designate as more holy or more religious. But in general, if you were to, I don't know, let's pretend an alien lands, right? Extraterrestrial life, and you want to show them a place that is tied to religion, you're not going to take them to a small altar in your house, right? You're going to take them to a house of worship. You're going to take them to um, a specific place that we have conceptualized and defined as more holy than others. So we can see this parallel from the Ninjarum to the Ulimam Ferrari that is present as well in even modern times, and the way that we conceptualize the religiosity of a particular space. There are some religions in Papua New Guinea, uh, some villages, some indigenous populations, where their houses are even built in the shape of the specific deities. And so the Sepik build their structures in the shape of a crocodile and go through like crocodile rites of initiation, where they go through ritual scarification to make their back appear as if it has scales like a crocodile would. So, just another illustration about how closely religion is tied into the other social aspects of living in a culture. And it can extend to architecture as well. Early anthropologists studying Native American populations observed that people identified with particular animals, claiming descent from them. This is again related to clan spirits. We call this very sharp tie to specific imagery, specific animals or plants or geographical features. We call that totemism. And so this is where we give clans, lineages, tribes, or other social groups emblems or totems. Until the 1920s, anthropologists interpreted these as evidence of a group's limited intellectual capacity. So that basically the number of levels to their totemic representations, i.e., how many animals were pictured in a totem pole, represented the maximum complexity of their social organization. So if you had a totem pole that had 3 animals represented, that meant that your definitions of your kind of social relationships and cultural complexity was capped at like 3 levels. We know now that this is not true, that um, even small scale, what we would have historically considered primitive societies, have a greater degree of social complexity than simply what's represented in the number of forms that their animist spirits can take, for example. So in modern times, I mean, even throughout the 1900s into modern times, a lot of totemism is secular in orientation. So it represented kind of tribal and clan affiliation, absolutely, but didn't play as much of a religious role per se. And we see this tie into, I mean, there are modern expressions of totemism, and I'm not talking about just simply populations that still construct things like totem poles. I mean, think about your sports teams, think about your mascots, right? You go to a New Mexico game, and everybody howls like a wolf and makes that little howling symbol with their fingers, right? Um, that's totemic representation, and we do this all the time with college mascots, sports teams, etc. So we still have quite a big kind of focus on totemism, even though from a religious standpoint, we would define the U.S. as being predominantly monotheistic. Okay, so even if totemism is secular, many traditional tribal societies understand their relation to their totemic animal in a supernatural way. So, whether that's through clan membership and this stipulated descent that they descended from the bear spirit or the eagle spirit, etc., there's still, even among native populations in the US, still this strong tie of totemism and iconography, symbolism, with the supernatural and religion. Now, that brings us to shamanism. We tend to, we as in like just normal everyday people, we would call them, in an academic setting, we call them the laity. People who don't study these particular things in an academic context, right? We tend to not draw much separation between animism per se and shamanism, right? And we tend to identify individuals who have specialized healing and or religious roles as shamans, regardless of whether a particular population practices shamanism. So, but what anthropologists mean by shamanism and shamanic expression is what we would call an ecstatic religious experience. In many societies, this is through trancing. Trances are key elements to shamanistic practice. These appear to allow shamans to accomplish difficult feats that would be impossible in normal circumstances. You have already watched trancing, right? As it was expressed in my story of a Kung woman, that Gunda became a healer. Gunda started trancing. And what did you notice in the trancing rituals that were expressed? I mean, there's dancing, there's music sometimes, there's a mentally altered state that shamans enter into that gives them unique capabilities of communicating with the spirit realm. And so, if you recall from where Gunda was trancing to try to save that baby girl, right, he said that she didn't want to be saved. He couldn't reach her, she couldn't hear him, etc. We see shamanistic healing in South American populations as well. The Yanomamo are a group that practice this. A shaman will attempt to heal alien individuals by ingesting hallucinogenic stuff made from a local plant. Through much of the Amazon, Brazil, Peru, etc., we're talking about ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is a mind-altering substance. There are a lot of, let's say, new age spiritual hippie white people who view ayahuasca as like sacred medicine, and that it has given them enlightened experiences where they finally understand the levels of the world and chakras and things like that. This is culture. I mean, essentially, it's cultural appropriation, right? Ayahuasca is used quite widely by shamanistic, religio-medico people, personnel, people who take on this healing and spiritual role. But ayahuasca also has a problem with addiction, and so as we've had this intersectionality of traditional ethnomedicine and ethno-spirituality with like modern urban settings, there's become a drug market for ayahuasca, and even among groups like the Yanomamo, um, in relatively recent historical times, women would complain about men past the age of 40 using way too much ayahuasca and basically just sitting around hanging out in a hammock high on traditional religio-medical substances, not contributing a lot to gardening, not going out hunting and getting protein, etc. So just be aware of that, and also be aware of how uh, white people traveling to Peru to have some transcendental experience with a tribe in ayahuasca um, is essentially cultural appropriation. All right, so the shaman in this context among the Yanomamo is supernaturally assisted by a spirit familiar. In northern Mexico, southern New Mexico, Arizona, we've got groups like the Huichol Indians that have traditionally used peyote, and again, this is something that in like the 1970s, 1980s, white New Age spiritual hippies also culturally appropriated peyote rituals, started doing things like sweat lodges and stuff like that. But among the Huichol, the hunt and use of peyote provides social order. So it's uh, structured very much the way that uh, hierarchy is structured. And there is a social order to the rituals involving peyote that mimics the social order of the sociopolitics of these native groups. Even among Christian traditions, Pentecostal and charismatic evangelical Christian traditions engage in rituals that are ecstatic religious experiences, like revivals, like snake handling, like speaking in tongues. I remember going to a revival with my grandparents when I was either 4 or 5, and I was terrified. It was a bunch of tents out in the field. It was super duper hot and humid because it was the South in the summer. Some of the tents had people who were holding like vipers. Some of the tents had people speaking in tongues, which just to me as a 4 and 5-year-old seemed gibberish. People everywhere were collapsing, overcome with heat and overcome with the Holy Spirit. It was really quite terrifying. So we can think about rituals not having to involve psychoactive substances. I mean, in many cases, they do. These psychoactive substances, I mean, think about heroin and poppies, right? That was used, the oil of poppy was used, or milk of poppy was used as a um, component of religious tradition and ritual well before it was ever kind of mass produced and providing high through its use in heroin. So many psychoactive substances have been used in religious traditions, and sometimes people justify their use of psychoactive substances through cultural appropriation of religious traditions. All right, but the hallmark of shamanism is this collective ecstatic religious experience. All right, so that brings us um, to polytheism and monotheism, where symbology reinforces a hierarchical social order. So we're going to talk specifically about the Kingdom of Benin. We're also going to talk about the Egyptian pharaohs as examples of this. But take a step back and think back to the previous weeks and how we've talked about adaptive strategy and how we've talked about socio-political typology. With agriculture, came a shift that we see very clearly in the archaeological record to first chiefdoms and secondly then states. Okay, and we've talked a little bit about the differences between these, right? Chiefdoms were organized on the basis of kinship, where the chief was considered deific in a way, whether it was an actual god come to earth, whether it was the ability to host a godly spirit, whether it was having some kind of special capability of communing with and identifying the god's wills. The chief uniquely possessed that skill, and then to varying degrees, relatives of the chief were also then tied to deific entities. And so you had what we call a continuum of ranked social statuses, so that uh, those that were most closely related to the chief were considered highest rank, and that rank declined as your degree of relatedness to the chief diminished. So we have a continuum of ranked social statuses among chiefdoms. Among states, remember, we did away with these um, these markers of kinship. We did away with the continuum, and we developed strict hierarchical social structures through social class, through castes, through some arbitrary demarcating of an individual's status. So we end up with the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. We end up with the elites and the commoners, the nobility and the peasants, the different tiers of castes that we find in the Indian caste system, etc. And so there existed social roles like the priesthood, etc., that had special access to the deities, but it wasn't on this basis of kinship. It was kind of an outgrowth of it, and often religion was tied to the elite, the wealthy, etc. But that didn't mean that lower class commoners didn't also have religious practices. Okay, so but what we see is the hierarchy present in the religion does mimic and reinforce the hierarchical social order of the society as a whole. So when we talk about these religions, when we talk about polytheism and monotheism, we are only talking about agricultural chiefdoms and states, and then the industrial and post-industrial populations that arise out of these. Okay? That doesn't mean that foragers can't believe in God per se, right? But much of that is done through evangelism and mission work. So there are Christian Ache in Paraguay, but that was not a natural outgrowth of their animistic religion that they had prior to being settled into reservations by Jesuit missionaries, right? So the complexities that are present, I mean, we can just think about the Puebloans, right? Many Puebloans identify as Catholic. Well, that was forced upon them, and that was evident through the mission building that the Spanish um, colonial efforts kind of spread throughout the desert Southwest, and doesn't represent, let's say, a genuine kind of transition from more animist clan spirits and shamanistic elements. All right, so in Benin, the Oba was considered divine and was symbolized by a leopard. The Oba was the highest ranking individual. You wouldn't really call them a king because it was religious in nature. You could call them a chief, but in Benin, we were talking about something that had many state-like characteristics. The Oba's palace was pictured as an architectural model of the cosmos, and so celestial bodies being mimicked in the towers and obelisks and such that were present in the architecture of the palace. You also found leopard imagery in the palace, in the arts, and in festivals that was depicted and helped maintain this social order. So Only those who were closest to the deities, only those who were closest or higher in the status hierarchy were able to use direct depictions of leopards in things like costumery, in their artistic representation, etc. Throughout the dynasties of China, if you travel to China even today and you visit some place like um, some of the temples that are present, some of the whether it's the ruins of older religious buildings or whether it's even modern religious buildings, there's a hierarchy of animal imagery that's present on the roofline of these buildings. The highest, holiest places where the dynastic, the emperor lived, would have 9 animals depicted. Lower religious professionals that were still part of the hierarchy might have 7. Local religious and political leaders might only have 5 animals present on the roof line of their buildings, whereas the peasantry might only have 1, and that animal that was depicted represented their kind of clan identity. So we see religion mapping on to this hierarchical social organization as well. When we look at polytheism and monotheism in these ancient societies, we see that the Egyptian pharaohs were earthly manifestations of the gods. And that the pharaohs were the most deific, but their religious officials had access to deities as well. Each of these gods then had to be appeased in its own way to maintain the environmental conditions necessary for agriculture in the Nile River Valley. So some gods needed flooding and water to appease them. Well, guess what that also did? That introduced the silt and organic material from the river to the areas that were going to be cultivated. So that was a way of fertilizing the soil. That different religious rituals offered to different deities have secular explanations as well, have kind of a function to them. The ancient Hebrews diverged from the polytheistic norm by proclaiming Yahweh as the one true God. This prompted then a long-term shift towards monotheism that persists to this day. So when we look throughout Mesopotamia, right, we had polytheistic hierarchical religious traditions present, and it was religious reformation that brought about monotheism, and it wasn't believed at first. These people were considered heretics at first, and this is true for Judaism, this is true for Christianity, this is true for Islam. Out of the Egyptian pantheon of gods, we have a transition to Amun-Ra being the monotheistic outgrowth of that, where Ra, the sun god, becomes the one true God. When we look at the pantheon in Hinduism, we have a monotheistic shift that comes out of that, where Krishna basically becomes symbolically very much like the Christ child, a virgin birth, lack of sin, a specialized kind of function as the son of the divine deity. So just something to keep in mind. One thing I want to challenge you with is to think about the fact that all of these religious traditions were conceptualized and proposed, and the rules of which, the ritual of which, were written by men. Whether you believe that that came with divine inspiration, or whether you believe that that came with simply how leaders manipulate the social order, that's your prerogative, right? It also brings up that I want us to think about the difference between big R religion, which is organized major world religion, and little r religion or religiosity, which is an innate human tendency to view the world through supernatural means, or with at least the acknowledgement of a supernatural realm and some form of spirituality. We have a human universal of religiosity. We do not have universal big R religions. Christianity is not quote unquote the way. Islam is not quote unquote the way. Judaism is not quote unquote the way, right? Rather, we've got culturally specific, context specific, site specific, and temporal specific, that means time specific, um, conceptions of the way for lots of different cultural traditions on the planet. So, as you practice whatever your particular religious traditions might be, recognize kind of the role or function that religion plays in your life, the aspects of your religion that come from man, i.e., Jesus was not born on December 25th. That wasn't tax season. The story of his birth all points to springtime, right? But rather, that was a concerted effort by the Pope to co opt local pagan traditions and imagery to get more people to convert to Christianity. So be aware of all of those aspects about your religion, and be try to be culturally relativistic when you're viewing with, interacting with, judging people of different religious traditions.